From the beginning to this day, it's likely that the majority of people have felt the desire to not choose. Not because they didn't know what to do, or because they lacked knowledge, or even because of laziness. The desire to not choose is the wish to avoid being responsible for the consequences of your own choice, even while fully aware of what you should do. You may have felt it from the moment you let a parent decide your degree, your job, your marriage, while telling yourself the decision wasn't yours to make. Although this desire is so common, it's rarely called by name. And what I've come to understand about why this happens to us says a lot about who we are, about what it costs us, and about the only way out. And first time it happened, it's portrayed both in the Bible and in other religions. In the garden, a man and a woman could eat from every tree of the garden, but God gave them only one command. Of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it, you shall die. But when the serpent promised Eve that he shall be like God, if they ate from the forbidden tree, Eve ate the fruit, and Adam ate the fruit Eve gave him. We know it wasn't for lack of knowledge, because they heard this command directly from God, as Genesis 2:17 says. We also know it wasn't because they didn't know what to do, because that same commandment from the God in Genesis 2:17 clearly established the consequences of disobedience. And as explained by the paragraph 398 of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, we know that man did this out of pride. Pride because he preferred himself to God himself, and pride because he wanted to be like God. When God searches for Adam, it's not because he doesn't know where he is, but because he wants to hear from Adam's own mouth what he had done. And Adam said, "The woman whom thou gavest to be with me, she gave me the fruit of the tree, and I ate." In a single sentence, Adam blames the woman, "She gave me of the tree," and he blames God, "The woman whom thou gavest to be with me." He didn't say, "The woman I choose to trust," nor "the woman I ate with." The first man's first response to being asked what he did, it's to point at two other people, his wife and his creator. And Eve, when God turns to her, does exactly the same thing. "The serpent beguiled me, and I ate." Both gave the same answer, and neither of them said, "It was my fault." The first thing the human race did, after the first sin, was to blame others for their choices. The first act of humanity is to refuse their responsibility. The pattern here isn't weakness, it's pride. He preferred himself to God when he took the fruit, and when God confronted him, he preferred himself again, this time by refusing to own what he had done. Same pattern shows twice in the same story, first in sin, then in answer to sin. And same pattern would be repeated again, not in a garden, but in front of an empire. And this time, the man being handed over wasn't hiding. He was standing there, silent and waiting. A Roman governor stood before a man he already knew was innocent. He said so himself, in the Gospel of Matthew, in the Gospel of Mark, in the Gospel of Luke, in the Gospel of John. "I find no crime in Jesus." Pontius Pilate had the authority to release him. He had the power to end it right there. He had the truth in front of him. And still, he looked for a way out. When he heard that Jesus was a Galilean, he saw an opening. Galilee wasn't his jurisdiction. That was Herod's problem. So he sent Jesus away, hoping the decision would be taken from his hands. And Herod treated him with contempt, mocked him, and sent him back. So Pilate tried something else. He offered the crowd a choice, not because he had to, but because it was tradition to release a prisoner at Passover. He put an innocent man next to a robber and asked the crowd to pick. He was betting the crowd would choose Jesus because he was innocent. But he was wrong. When the crowd demanded Barabbas, Pilate asked one more question. Then what shall I do with Jesus who is called Christ? Not what do I think, not what justice require. What shall I do, meaning tell me what to do. He is asking the crowd to make the decision he already knew was his to make. And when the crowd answered, "Crucify him!" Pilate did the last thing a man can do to pretend that he wasn't the one who decided. He washed his hands in front of everyone, not because it would clean anything, because it would let him say, in front of all of them, it wasn't my fault. The church doesn't read this act as a moment of weakness. It doesn't not read it as a tragic mistake by a man out of his death. In paragraph 1851 of the Catechism of Catholic Church, when listing the sins that manifested during the Passion of Christ, it names this directly. It calls it Pilate's cowardice. The same word the Magisterium uses is the one we would use ourselves if we were honest. And notice what cowardice means here. Not that Pilate was afraid of dying. He was afraid of losing his position, afraid of the crowd, afraid of what Caesar might hear. He preferred himself, his career, his peace, his standing, to the truth he had already recognized. The same preference as Adam, held up to the size of an empire and applied to the Son of God. Adam had a garden, Pilate had a standing, and you probably have neither. But somehow, without a garden, without a crowd, without a throne, you've done the exact same thing, with smaller stakes, but in the same shape. I remember when my classmates who would cheat on tests or copy homework, they trusted someone else's answer over their own, and every so often, that someone was wrong. When the answer came back marked wrong, they weren't angry at themselves. They were angry at the person who had given them the wrong answer, genuinely angry, as if they had been betrayed. Think about what that reveals. They had made two choices. The first was to copy instead of thinking, and the second was to trust someone else's answer over their own knowledge. Both were theirs, and when the outcome was bad, both disappeared from view. What remained was someone else to blame. The garden had one command, the courtroom had one innocent man, and the classroom had one wrong answer on the page. The scale changed, the shape doesn't. Adam did it, Pilate did it, and we do it every day, in rooms too small to notice. Because if you've been listening honestly, you've already seen yourself somewhere in this. Nobody escapes this pattern by accident. You don't drift out of it, you don't outgrow it. The only way out of it is the exact opposite of what Adam did, and what Pilate did, and what the classmate copying the wrong answer did. The only way out is to own what you chose, even when you're afraid, even when everyone is against you, even when it would be much easier to let someone else carry the weight of it. And there's a reason why this is hard. Every time you refuse to hand the decision to someone else, you take on something the world calls a burden, the weight of being the one who chose. The world is always offered you a way out of that weight, a crowd to blame, a circumstance to point to, a person who told you what to do. And every time you accept one of those exits, you are in some small way doing what Pilate did. The way out isn't to become reckless. It isn't to stop caring what people think overnight. The way out is to change who you are afraid of. Because you will fear something. Every people does. But the question is, whether you fear the judgment of the crowd more than the judgment of the one who made everything. Pilate feared the crowd and gave up the truth he had already seen. The saints throughout history feared God and stood in front of crowds that wanted them dead. Both are choices. Both have consequences, and both begin every single day with something small. A moment when you remained silent, or followed the crowd, or copied the answer, or washed your hands, and instead you choose the truth. I'm Piycan, and do not forget, do your duty, do not love the world, and remember, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed.